Make no mistake about it. You were born to be a true millennial.
Welcome to True Millennial. I'm Parker Walbeck, and in this video I wanted to do something new I haven't done before, which is basically a book summary or book highlights. I want to do this from time to time where I read a book and give you a condensed version to give you some of the best parts, the main principles it teaches. And the book I wanted to start with is called Insights from a Prophet's Life by Sheri Dew, which is basically a biography of the prophet's life, Russell M. Nelson. And this book was gifted to me by a buddy of mine, Dallin Wright. Shout out to Dallin. And it's one of my favorite Latter-day Saint books I've read. Now, I'm not going to be able to do it full justice. Please go read this book if you haven't. If you have read it, hopefully this is a great recap and reminder of some of the awesome lessons and principles that can be learned from his life. But the main point of this book, as Sheri Dew, the author, says, is to learn what kind of life preparation does the Lord give the men he will one day call to be a prophet, and what are the lessons that we can learn from such a life. Now, if you don't know Sheri Dew, she is an awesome member of the church. She's written actually several biographies on other prophets as well. And she says in the introduction, "May I suggest that my association with the Nelsons has given me access to information, conversations, and personal experiences that likely would not have been available to another writer. I hope my point of view is more informed than it is biased." So she recognizes that she's going to be accused as being biased because she personally knows the prophet and Wendy, his wife. And after reading this book, I would say that I don't think any other writer could have pulled out the information she did because of that relationship. So I agree that her perspective, in my opinion, is more informed than it is biased. Now, she starts off in the introduction quoting Gordon B. Hinckley, saying that prophets are ordinary men called to do an extraordinary work, basically alluding to the fact that they're not gods, they're not perfect, they're fallible men, but they're the best that God has to work with to do his perfect work. She says, "But prophets are not ordinary. There is nothing ordinary about their foreordination, about the burden and privilege they assume. Each prophet's mortal schooling is singular. In studying a prophet's life, we see how the Lord molds, prepares, and tutors a man so that at the appointed hour he is able, worthy, and ready to be his mouthpiece to lead his people." So that's what this book is understanding what the Lord puts these men through to prepare them for that holy calling. So the book is split up into 4 parts. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to be putting a little green circle in the top left that indicates which episode I'm pulling these quotes from. And if you go to the Deseret Book app, you can listen to this on audiobook, and you can find the episode I'm referencing, and you can listen to the full episode there if you want to learn more about that specific chapter that I'm referencing. But part 1 is called Laying a Foundation for Service. So Russell Nelson was born in 1924. He is 98 years old as of the making of this video, and his family was members of the church. However, though all 8 of his grandparents joined the church, not all remained faithful, so he was actually not raised in a gospel-centered home. He says, "My mother and father were just so wonderful. Every night was family home evening," meaning that dad may have been smoking a cigar, but it was family home evening nonetheless. They spent a lot of family time together. But he says the family didn't attend church together. His mother taught him to pray, and he saw that he attended church, though his siblings usually didn't. Russell said, "I wanted to know about the church because my family didn't give me that. I loved learning about the gospel." So he had a natural love for the gospel, even at a young age, even in a family that maybe didn't love the gospel as much as he naturally did. He says he learned about the word of wisdom, and one evening after his parents had been drinking, they raised their voices at each other, and so he went to the basement and drained every alcohol bottle they had, and he said, "I expected Daddy to be upset, but he never said a word. He knew that I was right." At age 16, he was baptized. He would attend church, but again, usually alone. And his parents were inactive for decades. And later he said, "As I matured and began to understand the magnificence of Heavenly Father's plan, I often said to myself, I don't want one more Christmas present. I just want to be sealed to my parents." It took a long time, but that gift did become a reality in 1977 when he was 53. He was finally sealed to his parents. But in his youth, he'd spend hours at Salt Lake Library, and he said he'd read stacks of books about all kinds of subjects. He just loved to learn, and he was naturally just very intelligent. He skipped the 5th grade, graduated from East High School in 1941 at age 16, and Russell Ballard, who was a few years younger than him at East High School as well, said he was a legend at East High School. He became a leader of just about everything he touched. Ever since then, I have counted him as one of my role models. And it was in high school that he decided he wanted to go to med school. Other Gregory A. Schweitzer, also a medical doctor, later confirmed he was a young genius. I've talked with people who were medical school classmates of his, and they always knew he would be number one in the class. There are certain physicians who are not just confident or bright, they are brilliant. They shine. He fits in that category. He later graduated from the U of U in 1947 with both his bachelor's and MD degrees at age 22. Now, I find this significant because despite him being an intellectual giant, academically brilliant, he remained humble and submissive his entire life, as you'll discover later in the book, to the words of prophets and to God, and didn't allow his intellect to overpower his spirit, but always kept that in check. In 1942, he meets Danzel at a musical play that they were both in, and he said he was instantly fixated on a beautiful brunette on stage who had the most hypnotic soprano voice he'd ever heard. She caught his eye and his ear. She was the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen, he said, and sensed and hoped that she would be the girl he would marry. For him, it was love at first sight. I fell madly in love with Danzel, and she made it clear that nobody was going to marry her unless they could do so in the temple. This motivated Russell to learn more about the gospel and prepare to go to the temple. 3 years later, after their first date in 1945, they were married in the Salt Lake Temple. When we married in the temple, we didn't know many scriptures, but we did know Matthew 6:33. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. That became the lodestar for every decision we made together. I love this idea that they were both pretty much infants in the gospel when they first got married, and yet now he is this spiritual giant who has all the scriptures memorized and who is the voice for the Lord as his prophet on earth, and yet grew up in a household that didn't really have the gospel. It was his willingness to learn, his willingness to be humble, and allow the Lord to direct and lead him in his life. Shortly after they moved to Minnesota for grad school, Russell would later say, leaving the nest is the best marriage glue I can imagine, because a husband and a wife have to deal with their challenges together. They can't go running home to mama and daddy. You tough it out and figure it out. There were 12 and a half years from the time I received my doctoral degree until I sent my first bill for surgical services. We borrowed money, Danzel earned some, I made a little here and there, somehow we survived. Despite poverty and a mountain of education ahead, they had their first girl, Marcia, in 1948, Russell being 24 and Danzel being 22. Later, when he would hear young couples question whether they could afford to have children, he would say, if we had waited until we could afford a child, we would have missed Marcia, Wendy, Gloria, Brenda, and Sylvia. Half of our children. Who would we have done without? They were stretched financially. Danzel worked 2 jobs to keep her husband in medical school. After her second job, they'd go together to the hospital to donate a pint of blood for $25. Don't forget to pay tithing on my blood money, Danzel would say. She was the breadwinner at $135 a month, and Russell contributed about $15 a month for his pay as an intern. When she asked him if he was paying his tithing, he said, I had regarded that as just a token payment designed to keep my teeth clean, haircut, and shoes polished. But when she confronted me with that question, I realized she was right and I was wrong. And so our tithing was increased to include 1/10 of that $15. I've been a full tithe payer ever since. So you'll see this recurring throughout the book, that Danzel was this driving force, pushing him along, making him a better man, helping him see the value of paying tithing, even if it's just $1, but getting him in that habit of exact obedience. At the University of Minnesota Medical School, he helped build the first heart-lung machine, and they learned first by operating on dog hearts, and the first heart-lung machine that he helped build was used in the first ever open heart surgery. So he was one of the pioneers in open heart surgery. At the time, he was told, you don't touch the heart. You'll kill a patient if you touch the heart. And he helped revolutionize this area of medicine. 1 year short of finishing his residency and getting his PhD, he enlisted in the Korean War. His research team was charged with determining why soldiers died once they entered military medical care systems. His team learned and improved treatments and saved many lives while there. And one evening while under attack, he tells of an experience where he shared a foxhole with a devout Catholic. Said they prayed together for their lives to be preserved, and he said it meant a lot to him to have someone who looked to the same source for comfort and strength despite their differing belief systems. 20 months into military service, he was promoted to captain, and his work caught the eye of Harvard Medical School, where he was invited to be an assistant resident in surgery. He learned a lot from the world-class surgeons there. It was a dream, a chance to increase my knowledge and improve my skills exponentially. It was, however, a very rigorous and stressful schedule. He averaged 7 of every 48 hours at home, and most of those, he said, he or the children were asleep. Now, that statistic shocked me, that he would spend 7 out of every 48 hours at home with 4 young children at home. I have 3 young children at home, and if I'm away 7 hours out of 48 hours, it impacts my wife's life a lot. So this is a huge testament to the workload that Danzel had and the amazing mother and wife she was, keeping that family afloat, keeping him through med school. She truly was a saintly woman. In his early stages of pioneering open heart surgery, he was drawn to these verses in D&C. All kingdoms have laws given, and unto every kingdom is given a law, and unto every law there are certain bounds also and conditions. When we obtain any blessing from God, it is by obedience to that law upon which it is predicated. Surely there are laws that govern the beating heart, laws that, if understood and obeyed, would result in blessings. In the case of his responsibility for patients, the blessings of being able to cure and heal their damaged hearts. Russell learned about the incontrovertibility of divine law in the operating room. Whenever a blessing is received, it's because law has been obeyed, and that means certain procedures will always work. That takes the pressure off an individual who is willing to study the laws that govern the physical body and be obedient to them. Divine law is irrefutable. And he'd often get chastised by other medical colleagues for not separating his profession and his religion. And he said, that startled me because I did not feel that truth should be fractionalized. Truth is indivisible. He said, you can pray all you want, you can hope all you want, but until the law is fulfilled upon which that blessing is predicated, it won't happen. You can have as much faith as you want, but unless you're willing to do the works, obey the laws, the blessings won't come. So that was part 1, his upbringing. Part 2 is healing hearts and building a home, diving into his medical career and more about his family growing. So in 1955, at age 31, he attempts his first open heart surgery. It was the first open heart surgery in Utah, and they were the 3rd state to do one, and it was the first one west of the Mississippi. He was a natural teacher. He trained dozens of residents from around the world in open heart surgery at the U of U, and he was asked, why not be more fierce with competition? And he said, truth was truth, and we shared it. Competition was with disease, ignorance, and death, not with each other. So he never held his cards close to his chest. He was always sharing his knowledge freely. He was less concerned about competing doctors and more concerned about saving lives. And he said, as he shared his knowledge, God gave him more knowledge. He also tells a story of a bad experience he once had assisting a surgeon who lost his temper in the operating room, and Russell told himself in that moment, Russell, you will never lose control in the operating room. You will always be able to handle things without getting upset. I resolved that I would discipline my body to be subject to the dominion of my spirit. He became a model of discipline. As it related to his body, it says that though he was blessed with a lean body, he would weigh himself every day and held back a little on what he ate if he went up a pound. And this is one of the characteristics or qualities that I feel the prophet developed in his life that allowed him to become the man he became, was his ability to discipline his body and keep it subject to his spirit. Discipline, the principle of discipline, was a huge part of allowing him to develop and become a prophet of God. One story he tells is he declined to operate on a tricuspid valve of Brother E. Lyman, who was a stake patriarch at the time, because this operation had never been done before. He said it was too dangerous. And to that, the patriarch responded that he had prayed and had been led to Russell Nelson. And he said, if you will operate on me, the Lord will make it known to you what to do. So he agreed reluctantly, and he said he prayed and prayed for inspiration to know how to do this operation, and he said nothing came. And then he said while operating, a diagram appeared in his mind showing him where to place sutures to essentially do a series of tucks and pleats that would reduce the circumference so that the valve tissue would cover the hole. It's a miracle, he said. I had no idea what I was going to do as I began that operation. I had not experienced pure revelation like that surgically before. But that was pure revelation. The faith of his patient inspired him to step into the dark and act in faith. And he had many experiences like that in surgery, where as a pioneer of heart surgery, he was doing things that had never been done before. And it was in his occupation as a heart surgeon that he first started learning that process of revelation and trusting to be able to step into the dark with faith and know that the Lord will be able to guide and direct him in that darkness. So again, another characteristic that was essential for him to learn as a prophet is how to receive revelation. In 1957, when Danzel was 35, she had a dream of a baby boy. And so they got pregnant, and it turned out to be a girl. And they would go on to have 4 more girls over the next 10 years, totaling 9 girls. But she kept having this vivid vision or dream of this boy that was supposed to be in their family. So she said stopping was not an option. She felt certain their family was not yet complete without the boy. So she got pregnant again at age 46 with already 9 girls. And while she was pregnant with that 10th child, Russell said he awoke in the middle of the night with a clear impression that she was carrying the son that she had been seeing for years, and that he should name him Russell Jr. When he was born, Danzel said, he's the one I've been seeing and known for all these years. So again, a cool story about personal revelation, feeling like their family wasn't done, and Russell receiving the same impression that she had been receiving for years about this boy that was supposed to be in their family. A little bit about his home and family life. He said family was everything to Russell. He loved his work and was immersed in it. He cherished calls to serve in the church, but when he's home, said Danzel. Despite all the acclaim, recognition, responsibility, and visibility, the blessings that meant the most to him came because of Danzel. And the eternal reality lodged with Russell that when all was said and done, the purpose of God's plan was to seal and exalt families. In 1964, when he was 40 years old, Russell was called as a stake president. This was his first big leadership calling. Though he was very busy, he said, "Of course I have time. I'll make time. If I have to change professions, I'll do it. If I am called, I will serve." He said him and Danzel made that decision when they got married in the temple to seek first the kingdom of God. So that dedication to always putting God first was another big characteristic of what allowed him to be shaped and molded by the Lord over the years. In his setting apart blessing, Elder Kimball blessed his quality of work as a surgeon to increase, and specifically that the mortality rate would decline. And the following year, Dr. Nelson's aortic valve surgery fell from 25% mortality to 2%, a feat that doctors around the country marveled at. When asked how he was doing it, he said, "We just got better at it. But I may have gotten better faster because of that blessing and ordination." So that was a true testament to that scripture that when you seek first God's kingdom and are willing to sacrifice and dedicate your time to the Lord, he was able to actually magnify him in his profession as well and make him one of the most successful doctors as far as mortality rates go in the entire country. In 1965, at age 41, Dr. Nelson was invited to work at the University of Chicago Medical School, and it would increase his salary from $300 a month to $5,000 a month and promised free tuition for all 10 of his children to any school in the country. And even Elder Oaks at the time was living there in Chicago and was trying to convince him to come live there with them. So he was pretty set. He said, "Yeah, we're doing this. This is a no-brainer." But someone told him, "I think you should go ask the prophet what he thinks." And he said, "I don't think the prophet cares where I work." And he says, "I think he would care. Go and ask him." So he asks the prophet David O. McKay for his advice. And after a long conversation, they go back and forth. David O. McKay slumps back in his chair, closes his eyes, and thinks for a long while, to the point where Dr. Nelson is thinking that something's wrong with him and needs to check a pulse. And then finally he comes to and says, "Brother Nelson, if I were you, I wouldn't be in a hurry to change neighborhoods. It doesn't feel good to me." Russell said, that was it. A prophet had spoken. If the prophet didn't feel right about it, we were not going to go. And again, this was one of the biggest characteristics, in my opinion, of what shaped this man to become a prophet, is that he always followed the prophet. He was always obedient to prophet's counsel. This demonstrated the childlike humility and simplicity of Russell Nelson's faith. He would later say, "I never ask myself, when does the prophet speak as a prophet and when does he not? My interest has been, how can I be more like him?" I believe we shouldn't put question marks behind the prophet's statements, but put exclamation points instead. And that attitude right there, Neil A. Anderson would say recently in a general conference that because he was more concerned about becoming like these men that God was using to be his mouthpiece, he would eventually become the mouthpiece himself. And the prophets aren't always going to be right. But if there's any man on the earth who's more capable of knowing what you should do in a certain scenario. The prophets are about as close as you're going to get to the will of the Lord. We always ask ourselves, what would Jesus do? And in certain scenarios, it's hard to know. And I look to the brethren, I look to the prophet as our best examples on this earth of what Christ would do. After about 7 years of serving as a stake president in 1971, at age 47, he was called as a Sunday school president for 8 years until 1979, and then he was called as a regional representative of the 12 Apostles. And again, he said he would accept the call even if he had to leave his medical practice, but the first presidency insisted that they would only extend the call if he could continue his work as a surgeon as well. They didn't want him giving up that occupation quite yet. And divinely so, because in 1972, Elder Kimball, who at the time was 72 years old, needed an aortic valve replacement and a coronary graft. And President Nelson said, "We have no experience operating on a 72-year-old with both of these conditions. It would entail extremely high risk, and as a surgeon, I cannot recommend it." And as I sat in a meeting with all of the brethren, Elder Kimball said to the rest of them, "There you have it, brethren. I am an old man, and I'm ready to die." And then Harold B. Lee, who was the president of the 12 at the time, rose to his feet, pounded the desk, and declared, "Spencer, you have been called. You are not to die. You are to do everything you need to do in order to care for yourself and continue to live." And to that, he responded, "All right, then I will have the operation," putting a ton of pressure on Dr. Nelson to perform this for an apostle of the Lord, an operation that he'd never done before and wouldn't recommend. So President Lee gave Russell a blessing and said, "You have been raised up by the Lord to do this operation, and you will do it with great success." Later, while in the operating room, President Nelson said that heaven magnified the experience. That day, it was as though we pitched a perfect game. Not one instrument dropped, nothing unexpected occurred. There was not one technical flaw in a series of thousands of intricate manipulations. Each step was perfect. We were servants of the Lord that day. And again, I'm not doing these stories justice. You have to hear all the details. They're truly amazing stories. I was teary-eyed, feeling the spirit in so many of these stories, but I'm just giving you the overview ideas of what transpired in his life and some of the experiences he had. But he said during the surgery, Russell received the unmistakable impression that this man would live to be the president of the church. And he said, "I understood why heaven had been so involved in that perfect operation," which came as a big surprise to him. And he ended up telling Elder Kimball after the operation about that impression. They both hugged each other and wept because nobody expected President W. Kimball to outlive the much healthier and higher up in succession Harold B. Lee. But while Elder Kimball was still recovering from surgery, the prophet Joseph Fielding Smith at the time passed away. And then Harold B. Lee became the prophet, putting Kimball next in succession. And then without warning, President Lee died at a young age of 74. Most expected him to be the prophet for decades. 74 is pretty young for an apostle. So 3 prophets had died within 3 years, David O. McCabe being the other of those. And the man who should have died, Spencer Kimball, had God not stepped in and saved his life through that surgery, he ends up serving as prophet for 12 years. And among other things, it was under President Kimball that the priesthood became available to all worthy males. My consensus from this experience is that the Lord will have serve whom he wills. Now, that's not to take anything away from Harold B. Lee and these other prophets. They were mighty men. But clearly the Lord wanted Spencer W. Kimball specifically to serve in this specific era of time. I had a friend of mine who made fun of the church for their way of having prophets through succession, saying that it wasn't divine, it wasn't inspired, because it's just whoever's oldest gets to be the prophet. And I said, well, first of all, to even come into a line of succession, you have to be called by revelation by the prophet to become one of the 12 apostles. So clearly the Lord is okay with any of those 12 men being the prophet, if he knows that apostleship could eventually lead to becoming the prophet. But secondly, you have stories like this, where 3 of the brethren who were in succession to become the prophet died unexpectedly in early ages, and the man who was supposed to die of heart failure ends up having a miraculous surgery and ends up being the prophet for 12 years after that. That is not by coincidence. The Lord's hand is in the work, and he will have serve whom he wills. In 1978, at 54 years old, President Kimball says, "How many of us speak Mandarin Chinese? We must prepare while there is still time to prepare to teach these people." So again, his obedience to the prophet, Russell and Danzel immediately begin learning Mandarin. And a few months later, he meets a Dr. Wu Yingkai head of the Fuwai Hospital in Beijing, at a medical meeting in Boston. And from there, those two built a friendship, and he was invited to teach heart surgery in China. Then in 1980, at 56 years old, Russell and Danzel visit China and teach Chinese surgeons how to do heart surgery. And there they meet a Dr. Zhang, who they invite to come to Salt Lake City to learn from his surgeries in Utah. And while visiting, they would have him over for dinner, they'd play ping pong, and they would build a friendship. Over the years, they grew this friendship, and then years later, in 1990, Dr. Zhang sent Russell a letter explaining that he had lived under Japanese rule, Chinese rule, in a Presbyterian environment, yet the only way of living that made sense to him was Russell Nelson's. And at the time, he couldn't be taught in China, and so he said, look, if I move to Canada, where my daughter lives, will I be able to learn more about your church? And he said, yes, we will be able to teach you. And so they move, and Russell Nelson calls the mission president in Toronto and says, send your best missionaries over to this man, and they begin having the missionary discussions. Shortly thereafter, they are told that he's ready for baptism. So Russell, who is now an apostle, requests assignment in Eastern USA during the week of Dr. Zhang's baptism. And much to everyone's surprise, in Toronto, Elder Nelson walked in unannounced but prepared to baptize his longtime friend, Dr. Zhang. He then ordained him to the Aaronic priesthood so he could baptize his wife. And then 4 months later, Elder Nelson attended the dedication of the Toronto Temple, where he saw them both in the temple, and he said, I wept for him, and so did he. And then a year later, Elder Nelson was able to perform their sealing. And it all began with Russell accepting President Kimball's charge to learn Mandarin. An amazing example, again, of following the prophet and seeing the blessings that come. Okay, moving on to part number 3 out of 4. This is his time as an apostle, serving in the quorum of the 12 apostles. In 1983, at 59 years old, 2 apostles died, leaving 2 vacant seats in the quorum of the 12. President Kimball, who at the time had poor health, emerged long enough from the fog of an increasingly feeble mind to receive the revelation to, quote, call Nelson and Oakes to the quorum of the 12 in that order. Now, this goes back to my defense of the divinity of the call of the 12 apostles who can potentially become a prophet, that they went months without filling those seats for the 12 because President Kimball wasn't in a healthy enough state of mind to be able to receive that revelation. And it's not nilly-willy, like, oh, well, this guy's pretty good, let's just call him to it. We don't need the prophet to weigh in on this. We can decide. There's lots of good candidates out there. That's not how it works. That's not how the church operates. It operates through revelation through the prophet of God. And so they could not make any decisions on who should be in the quorum of the 12 until the prophet was clear enough in his mind to be able to receive that revelation. And even then, it wasn't just, Nelson and Oakes should be fine. It was Nelson and Oakes in that order, which turns out being very significant because now President Nelson has been the prophet for the last 5 years instead of Elder Oakes. And then it says 2 days later, President Hinckley asked Russell just one question: is your life in order? When he said yes, he said, good, because tomorrow we're presenting your name to be sustained as one of the 12 apostles. President Hinckley then embraced the stunned Nelson, and both men wept. When he told Danzel, she replied, I know of no one more worthy than you. Of all the people who knew my imperfections, she knew them better than anyone. So for her to respond as she did meant everything to me. As she had done so many times before, she calmed my heart that day. But after the initial shock was over, I felt a huge gap between where I was spiritually and where I needed to be. I'd been a surgeon for 35 years and was to the point where I could perform those duties well, but I instantly felt aware of my weaknesses and shortcomings and wondered how I could possibly measure up to the spiritual standard of my brethren in the 12. With this ordination as an apostle, Elder Nelson did what every other man called to the 12, both anciently and in this dispensation, has done. He straightway laid down his nets, forsook all, and followed him. He finished out his existing appointments as a doctor, but made no new commitments in his occupation. In 1985, Ezra Taft Benson assigns Elder Nelson, who is now 61, to the affairs of the church in Europe and Africa, with a special assignment to open the nations of Eastern Europe that were at the time under the yoke of communism for the preaching of the gospel. This was just 19 months into his calling, and he thought, are you sure Dallin shouldn't do that? Dallin H. Oakes. He's an attorney. I'm a heart surgeon. What do I know about opening countries? Yet a prophet had given an assignment, and so he set out to do what seemed at the time utterly impossible. This is one of the coolest stories, I think, from his life, and most significant feats was him going into Eastern Europe, communist Europe, and the experiences he shares next about how he opened up the hearts and these countries to the preaching of the gospel is just, it's miraculous. So as Elder Nelson went to each of these Eastern European countries, he asked this simple question: what is your greatest problem and how can we help you? In Hungary, Elder Nelson indicated that they had the highest death rate from alcoholism in Europe. And he said, our church may be able to help with that. And a year later, in 1987, he went to Budapest to sign papers granting the church's official recognition in Hungary, and he dedicated it for the preaching of the gospel. In Romania, he asked, in one word, how can we help you? The one word was orphans. So once he got back to Salt Lake, he set in motion calling humanitarian missionaries for Romania and rallied experts from church social services. Elder Nelson's skills at diagnosing the source of a country's pain repeatedly opened doors throughout Eastern Europe. He said, we were able to help with the Constitution in one place, with orphans in another, with alcoholism in another. Everyone has pain somewhere, and our challenge is to find out where the pain is. The church literally has the capacity to help people no matter what their problem is. The gospel exists to help people. So Elder Nelson was an amazing example of how true missionary work is done, is by finding the pain points, what is actually relevant and hurting you that you need help with in your life. Let's address that, show you that the gospel can help you with that, and they will naturally be opened to the message of Jesus Christ once they see the fruits of what the gospel can bring to their life. Elder Gregory Schweitzer, who served as a mission president in Russia, said, Eastern Europe had a natural kind of skepticism about people, but Elder Nelson melts their hearts. He's the perfect balance of kindness, confidence, caring, and integrity. They absolutely trust him. President James E. Faust observed, Russell M. Nelson has an exceptional intuitive gift for knowing what to do and say with people in different countries. He is a natural diplomat. And that diplomacy usually began with a fundamental question: how can we help? So again, I love this idea that he was this perfect balance of kindness, confidence, caring, integrity. He was able to gain people's trust. He had this ability to melt people's hearts. And so it wasn't his legal background that was going to get him in these countries. It was his ability to persuade and influence and serve and diagnose people's problems. It was his interhuman communication skills. And again, I think that is one of these characteristics that is necessary for these brethren to learn, to be qualified to be the voice for the Lord in persuading and influencing the entire world to follow Christ. When later asked what he learned from the assignment, Elder Nelson replied, the Lord likes effort. He could have said, Moses, I'll meet you halfway, but Moses had to go all the way to the top of Mount Sinai. He required effort from Moses and Joshua and Joseph Smith, from all of the subsequent presidents of the church. He requires efforts from bishops and Stake Relief Society presidents and Elder Quorum presidents. There is always a test. Are you willing to do really hard things? Once you've shown you're willing to do your part, he will always help you. Now, one thing about President Nelson is he also had plenty of hardship. He can relate to those who have undergone difficult trials. At one point, both Danzel and his daughter Emily went through chemo at the same time. And then in 1995, Emily, his daughter, died with a liver filled with cancer at just age 37, leaving behind a husband, 5 children, the youngest of them being a 3-year-old. He said, I was her father, a medical doctor, and an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ. But I had to bow my head and acknowledge, not my will, but thine be done. Now, luckily, Danzel went into remission and was able to recover from her cancer. But I can't imagine losing a son or a daughter, the heartbreak that brings. And he's felt it, he understands it, and I think that's also been a part of his molding and shaping process as an apostle, to be able to empathize with those who go through such hardship. As the year 2000 approached, at age 76, the 12 looked to commemorate the anniversary of Jesus Christ. We realized we had never put forward in a combined way the testimony of all the living prophets and apostles concerning Jesus Christ, and that doing so could be our commemorative action. Elder Nelson was assigned to oversee the project. Again, I didn't realize how involved he was in producing all these documents that have been so vital to the restoring of the church. In 2005, at 80 years old, while sitting at home on the couch holding hands watching a basketball game, Danzel's heart stopped. Russell attempted to resuscitate her longer than he knew was useful, but to no avail. I was all alone, he said. I had 10 children and I couldn't find any of them. It took several hours to reach his immediate family, and all the while he sobbed and then sobbed some more. While he was still alone and crying, he received an unmistakable impression. It wasn't audible, but it was very clear. The message was, I took her because my love for her, and I thought you could take it, my boy. Danzel's passing was a gift for her. She was experiencing a lot of health challenges for many years. The silence of being a widower was deafening. It was a season of deep grief. With questions of the future, he met with President Hinckley and asked his counsel on remarrying. President Hinckley responded that it was entirely up to him, that different brethren had handled this circumstance in different ways. Elder Nelson then asked a second question, is it easier to assign me to serve if I have a wife? President Hinckley replied that it was easier to be a part of the rule rather than an exception to the rule. With that counsel, Elder Nelson knew he should consider remarrying. He didn't want anything to interfere with his ability to serve the Lord, but at the moment, he couldn't fathom it. A few months later, while Elder Nelson was traveling alone to Europe, he grabbed a book to read on the plane called Rock Solid Relationships by Wendy Watson. Once he arrived in Rome, he received a handwritten letter from Sherry Dew that had been delivered by some sister missionaries, and Wendy, who was with Sherry at the time of writing the letter, had her name signed to it as well. When Elder Nelson saw her name, it jumped off the page. In that moment, he had a strong, immediate, and clear spiritual impression about her, that when he was ready for remarriage, he needed to meet this woman. The day came when Elder Nelson felt prompted to reach out. As they became acquainted, it was clear that heaven was orchestrating their union. When Elder Nelson proposed, Wendy said, there was still plenty of things I don't know about you, but I do know revelation. Wendy had experienced 3 broken engagements in earlier years, and she wasn't interested in repeating the experience with an apostle. So they both had sought clear direction on whether or not to even go on a first date. Both of them wouldn't even go on a date until they had clear direction from the Lord that this was the right thing to do. And so once they actually started dating, it was almost like, well, we already received our answer, so let's get married. In 2006, President Hinckley performed their sealing, and Wendy Nelson would say later, marriage was not an easy transition. She became part of an enormous family. She was the 113th member to enter the Nelson family. President Nelson would say that learning communication with a new spouse after decades of learning how to communicate with a different spouse was a very big challenge for them. So if learning how to have a successful marriage with one woman wasn't enough, relearning it at an old age with a completely different woman and going through both of those marriage processes, I think, again, was another refining thing in his life that allowed him to have certain experiences and shape his personality in ways that would allow him to connect and influence a wide array of people. Now, in 2009, when he was 85, they had a really cool experience in Mozambique when they were visiting the mission home there. While eating dinner with the mission president and his wife and the area president couple, 3 large African men broke into the home with AK-47s. One of them put a gun to Elder Nelson's head, and he pulled the trigger, and the gun made a clicking sound but didn't fire. The robber then kicked him in the face, knocking him to the floor, and Elder Nelson said later, I thought to myself, I'm going to pass out of this life and into the next, and this is going to be a very interesting experience. Most interesting of all is that I was calm. Through a series of miracles, the robbers were spooked and ran off, leaving everyone relatively unharmed. Both Wendy and I know that there were angels there to help us. So that was one of his near-death experiences, he tells. He then tells a different near-death experience he had many years earlier, in 1976. He said, Russell was on a small plane going from Salt Lake to St. George when the engine on the right wing exploded and burst into flames, causing the plane to go into a free-fall death spiral. The woman across the aisle began screaming hysterically, but Russell felt calm. It was the most amazing thing. I thought, my wife and I are sealed, our children are sealed to us, I've honored my covenants, I'll meet my ancestors and go on to a glorious resurrection. So I love this example of the faith and assurance he had in the plan of salvation. It wasn't just something he preached over the pulpit, it was something he lived and felt deeply inside him. That the plan of salvation is real, that there is life after death, and that if you live what he preached you should live, you will have peace in this life and eternal life in the life to come. Okay, moving on to the last and final part, number 4, is President of the 12 and President of the Church. 2015 to 2019. This book was written in 2019, so we don't have the latest of what he's been up to, but this gives you a good idea of his first few years as a prophet. So in 2015, L. Tom Perry and President Packer both died within 5 weeks, suddenly making Elder Nelson the president of the Quorum of the 12. After 3 decades, about 34 years of fulfilling assignments as an apostle, it was now his duty to make the assignments. He said that each member of the 12 is an apostle for the whole world, and in his years of experience, he needs to learn about every part of the world, along with the people and language and history. The president of the 12 is responsible for making sure this happens for each apostle, and he's also responsible for making every assignment to all the 70s. Being president of the 12 is a huge responsibility. Now, this again reiterates this idea that if you get called to the 12, it is a preparatory step to you becoming a prophet if called upon to do so. As he says here, that the responsibility of the president of the 12 is to make sure that all the other 12 apostles are getting all the experiences, assignments they need that are going to shape them and help them become everything the Lord expects them to become, so that, if called upon to become a prophet, they are ready to do so. Now, here's a few quotes from the brethren about how he has been as a leader for them. Elder Holland said, "President Nelson is a wonderful listener. That isn't a talent some of us have cultivated. We talk a lot, but he has shown us how to be a wonderful listener." Elder Oak said, "He's also a great delegator, an extremely good delegator, better than most leaders I've seen. He is a man of superb judgment, but someone who never judged them." Elder Nelson would say, "If you're a leader and servant in the Lord's church, then you'd better do your best to lead in the Lord's way." And those are just a few quotes, but all the brethren talk about him in such high regard, all these amazing qualities that he possesses that make him such an amazing, impactful, and influential leader and prophet. But coming back to his relationship with women, Sherry Dew tells us that when Russell says he chose medicine because he couldn't choose motherhood, he meant it. He has a deep personal feeling about how vital women are. "How I adore my daughters. They shape the future of the world." And then this quote I love from him. He says, "Men provide for the present, but women shape the future." I thought that was such a profound statement, that men are looked at as, oh, well, they have the priesthood and they make the money and whatever other typical male gender roles that we have in our society and in our church. But when you look at it in this light, that men's primary role is to take care of the present, but that women are the ones who are shaping the future, when you take seriously that role as a woman, then you are the one creating any men who in the future will take care of the present. You are the one that will be able to shape any change that you want to occur in society or in the church through how you lead your homes, through how you raise your children. Why wouldn't that be just as, if not more important, than handling present affairs of the church and family? Men and women's roles are different, but equally important in the Lord's work. In 2017, at age 92, President Nelson receives an impression to skip lunch between General Conference sessions and visit the hospital bedside of Elder Hales, who was in poor health. And shortly after arriving to his side, Elder Hales passed away just 10 minutes after. So again, this was a great example of him acting on impressions that he receives from the Holy Ghost, and also a great example of his ongoing dedication and service to be there for his brethren. One awesome example, and this one, just this image right here is so powerful to me of the man he is. But one awesome experience it shares is that in 2007 General Conference, Elder Joseph B. Wortham began trembling while delivering his talk. As the minutes passed on and the trembling worsened, Elder Nelson stood behind him, putting a hand on his shoulder and grabbing his belt with the other. He remained there for the last 5 minutes of his talk, then helped him to his seat. Elder Nelson's call to the 12 complemented perfectly his professional training as a healer, because they both satisfied the two great commandments to love God and neighbor. It was natural for him to watch over the health of his brethren, as he himself had stated, "One loves best who serves best." So again, President Nelson is one of the greatest examples when you read about his life, read about his interactions with people, with the brethren, with the world. He is a man of service. He serves other people, and because he serves other people, his love for them is increased. He truly does love us as members of the church, and even not members of the church. He loves everybody. And that's something that leaders of the church are criticized for, is being too harsh and not understanding what people are going through. And once you read about his life and understand the people he associates with, the things he's gone through, he does know what's going on. He does understand you, and he loves you more than most people are capable of because of his 98 years of life experiences that he's had. So that was his time as president of the Quorum of the 12. It didn't last long, only a couple of years. And then in January of 2018, President Monson passed away. And shortly after, Russell Nelson was ordained president of the church and called his counselors. And then Wendy Nelson shares this very sacred experience. She says, 2 days after President Monson passed away, the Lord gave Wendy this amazing experience. She said, I had a most unique and most distinctive experience with my husband to let me know that the mantle of the prophet was upon him. It was a never to be forgotten experience. It was so vivid, so clear, and so real. Then 2 days later, she had the same experience. She said that experience repeated twice is too sacred for me to share over the pulpit, but it is one I can never forget or deny. I know that President Russell Marion Nelson has been called by God to be the living prophet of the Lord on the earth today. What a powerful testimony from the wife of the prophet. But she was given that reassurance from the Lord that he was the new prophet to be the mouthpiece for the Lord. Now, I had the personal privilege to meet Elder Nelson in my mission in Argentina. He came to our little MTC of maybe 30, 40 missionaries. So I got to be in a small room with him and feel the presence of an apostle and shake his hand afterwards. And even then, I could feel the spirit of the presence of an apostle. But when he became the prophet, I personally saw the mantle of the prophet shift, fall upon him, and I could see and feel the Spirit testifying to me personally that this man is the prophet of God. My wife and I talk about it all the time. When he speaks in general conference, we love all the apostles' messages, and they're all very powerful. But when he speaks, we can feel a difference. We can feel that he is on a whole new level of revelation, that he is speaking with the Lord personally, and the Spirit testifies to us that truth every time we listen to him speak. She then goes on to share more experiences, saying that she was used to Russell waking up in the night with ideas and revelation, but she said since becoming president of the church, the nighttime messages to him have increased exponentially. She said one Saturday morning she experienced something unusual. She woke up early and had the distinct impression that she should leave the room. And then 2 hours later, he said, Wendy, you won't believe what has been happening over the past 2 hours since you left. The Lord has given me detailed instructions about a process I am to follow on a crucial matter. She said, I am a witness, sometimes by being absent and sometimes by being present, that the Lord indeed instructs his prophets. I mean, it's experiences like this that are just really hard to deny. The man is speaking with God. Now, this is something I look up to as well that I really love about him is how much he cares about the health of his body and how well he takes care of his body. As a 98-year-old, he has impeccable health. So one story says that the golf carts that transport church leaders through underground tunnels to various locations, for the first time in anyone's memory, came back empty shortly after he was called as prophet, because he would just walk everywhere. And so the other brethren said, well, if this 93-year-old president can walk, then everyone can walk. And so a lot of them started walking more often instead of riding in these golf carts. He would also take the stairs instead of elevators, and he also skied almost every Monday until he became the prophet. They finally said, hey, we need, for security and safety reasons, we can't have you on the slopes. But up until his 90s, he would go skiing almost every week. And Sherry Dew tells us that President Nelson had spent his professional career trying to heal bodies. Nowhere did he indicate his respect for the gift of a body more than in the way he cared for his own. And that, I think, is self-evidence in the shape he is in at 98 years old today. Then in the first 6 months of his presidency, he just went on a tear, announcing back-to-back all kinds of changes in the church. First, he changed home teaching to ministering, and then he restructured elders' quorums. He ended the Boy Scout relationship. He called the first Asian and Brazilian apostles. He announced the first temples to be built in India and Russia. Everything he was doing seemed to have a global outlook. He had the whole world in mind, basically saying, well, look, we're not just an American church. We are a church for the whole world. And I think that this has a lot to do in preparing the entire world for the second coming of Jesus Christ. The church was restored in America and has slowly been growing across the world. But Elder Nelson is making a lot of shifts and changes in the cultures and policies to make it much easier for the church and the gospel to function and be applied in the entire world, no matter the culture or circumstance. Now, though these changes came in what felt like rapid-fire succession, the brethren had weighed them carefully for some time, in some cases many years. And President Nelson said, the calling of 15 men to the holy apostleship provides a great protection for us as members of the church. Why? Because decisions of these leaders must be unanimous. Can you imagine how the Spirit needs to move upon 15 men to bring about unanimity? These 15 men have varied education and professional backgrounds, with differing opinions about many things. Trust me, these 15 men, prophets, seers, and revelators, know what the will of the Lord is when unanimity is reached. When he says, trust me, you know he's referring to probably a lot of heated arguments. I wouldn't call them contentious, but I'm sure they get into a lot of heated arguments about what the will of the Lord is. And for all of them to have to come to agreement on something before it becomes a policy or a statement for the whole church just shows you the beauty of this organization. Ultimately, I trust that these men are inspired of God, and as they come together as 15 men and make decisions together, I know that they are giving us the mind and the will of the Lord. Now, an interesting fact about President Nelson is that he actually met and interacted with 10 out of the 16 presidents of the church. That's a testament to how old he is, but I also don't think it's any coincidence that he has been given those opportunities to be mentored by all these prophets in preparation for him to become a prophet. Sherry Dew says that such mentoring by this succession of church leaders helped Russell Nelson's view of that office expand and mature through the years. President Nelson's various experiences with presidents of the church only reconfirmed and accentuated what he believed, that they led the Lord's church under his direction, and that they communicated with God in behalf of his people, and that heeding their counsel was spiritually wise. He's also a classic early adopter. This is something I love about him because I love technology. He was one of the first general authorities to get a computer, one of the first to adopt new technologies, to get the latest iPhone or latest iPad, and he was the first prophet to have Wi-Fi installed in the president's office, and the first time that there was a computer with 2 monitors, no less, in the president's office. He's an insatiable student, says Sherry Dew. He loves learning languages. He will memorize talks in the native languages of the countries he visits. So he's learned the basics of a lot of languages, and then he'll write a talk and then have it translated to that language. Then he'll listen to it on the plane ride to that country, and he'll memorize how to pronounce things so that he can deliver his talks in the native language of the people he's visiting. I mean, that is next level dedication to the people of the world. When he could just use a translator, he just puts forth that effort to make these interactions with everyone around the world more special. And as soon as he became prophet, he just started traveling the globe. Dubbed the Global Ministry Tour, President and Sister Nelson set out on a 12-day voyage that covered 30,000 miles in 7 countries. The gathering of Israel was in process all over the world. After introducing ministering, President Nelson set out around the world to show how it is done. Not just in word, he's always showing in example, living what he preaches. The travel was wearing on everyone, let alone a man in his 90s, but it was also rejuvenating to be with the members. Broadening is how he described it. We enjoy meeting with the people. They energize us. We learn their names, their culture, their language. And this is one of my favorite lines in the book that more than any other line has stuck with me and I think about often. He says, whenever I'm comfortably situated in our home, I'm in the wrong place. I need to be where the people are. I love that because it just cuts at the complacency or apathy we can often fall into as members of the church, especially affluent members of the church where we've been blessed with so much. I believe that God doesn't bless us with all of these amazing things just so we can be comfortable in our living room. Of course, he wants us to be happy and feel blessed, but that's not the end of it. He wants us to use all those blessings to bless the rest of humanity, the rest of the world that doesn't have those same blessings you have. And he's such an amazing example of that, he won't even allow himself to sit comfortably for too long in his living room without thinking, I got to get out and go serve somebody. I got to get out of my comfort zone and push myself to make somebody else more comfortable. But moving over to his family one last time, I loved this bit in the book that just talks about some of the challenges of his family. Sherry Dew says that with 220 members in the Nelson family as of 2019, some boys didn't serve missions, some who went on missions didn't finish missions, some members of the family left church activity, others wrestle with questions, 2 of his daughters dealt with divorce, some have serious health challenges, other grandchildren have had gender identity issues. However, the strength of the extended Nelson family provided a buffer and a place of security for those who chose to seek it, which most did. And he has faith that in time, the Lord will help with even the most serious challenges in his family. His nature to minister to every one of them has not diminished in the least by the fact that he now has the entire church to worry about. I love this chapter because it just shows the human nature of the prophet and his family. There's plenty of people in his family who are going through every trial and difficulty that we know of. And to think that this man is out of touch and doesn't know the real problems that we're dealing with and is just making broad assumptions of why people are leaving the church. He's not assuming anything. His own children and grandchildren are going through this. He speaks with them personally. He knows their individual stories. He ministers to them on an individual level. He knows what everyone in the world is going through. Just through this microcosm of his own family of 220 members, he gets to see a small sample size of all the issues in the world. He is very well informed. He knows and understands and loves everybody who's going through every kind of difficulty. And yet he still chooses to get up on the pulpit every 6 months and tell us how important it is to follow Jesus Christ, to live the doctrines taught in this church, even if we don't agree with them, even if his grandchildren don't agree with them, even if he might offend some of his own family members. He boldly and meekly declares and defends the truths of the gospel because he knows that those truths are ultimately what are going to help his children and grandchildren more than anything else he can offer them. You can call this man a lot of things. You cannot call him uninformed and out of touch. So a few changes that he's made since becoming prophet. In June of 2018, Come Follow Me was introduced to make the home the primary gospel learning location. Then in October General Conference, he announced 2-hour church in a new home-centered church supported by what takes place inside church buildings. So this was significant because just over a year later, after he shifts the whole church to learn how to have church at home and not depend on being inside a building, a global pandemic hits. The Lord revealed to his prophet when it was time to shift things to the home, and when a pandemic hit and we were no longer allowed to go to church, we were prepared and ready to have church at home. Is that a coincidence or is that prophetic? Absolutely, it's not a coincidence. Then in August of 2018, President Nelson announced, "The Lord has impressed upon my mind the importance of the name he has revealed for his church, even the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints." He said, "Please avoid using LDS or Mormon. I promise that if we will do our best to restore the correct name of the Lord's church, he whose church this is will pour down his power and blessings upon the heads of the Latter-day Saints, the likes of which we have never seen." Now with that, they also changed the symbol, the logo of the church, to include the Christus. But I want to share just a personal testimony of blessings that have come from this council. On my Instagram account, I have always had listed in there Mormon.org. And when the church changed their URL to comeuntoChrist.org, and I changed that out in my bio, I went from never hearing any Christians talk to me about my faith to suddenly, on a weekly basis, somebody will comment, send me a DM and say, "Hey, I didn't know you were a follower of Christ. Awesome, man. Fellow Christian." People didn't think I was Christian because our church was nicknamed the Mormon Church. So within those first few months, he made a ton of changes. And then he said, "In coming days, I will report my stewardship to the prophet Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and Spencer W. Kimball and others, and I want to be able to tell them I've done what the Lord wanted me to do. We are witnesses to a process of restoration. If you think the church has been fully restored, you're just seeing the beginning. There is much more to come. Wait till next year, and then the next year. Eat your vitamin pills, get your rest. It's going to be exciting." And it has been exciting. Anyone who has been aware of the changes that have been made over the past few years since he's been the prophet have seen the awesome changes that have been coming. Just to name a few, we've already named a few that he changed right out the gates, but this book was written in 2019, so it's been a few years since then, and here's some of the other changes that have also occurred. One of the big things has been his focus on temples worldwide. Out of the 300 temples we have in the world, 118 of those have been announced by President Nelson in just the past 5 years. He's also made a ton of changes to temple ordinance wording and procedures. He also announced an official restoration proclamation. The For the Strength of Youth pamphlet was updated. There were some organizational changes like no more young men's presidents, no beehives, no maids for young women's. Deacons can now be called at 11 years old. Missionaries can all call home weekly versus biannually and have a lot more regular communication. In January of 2020, all missionaries were given smartphones, and it was only weeks later after he made that change that the pandemic hit. Again, very prophetic that he would get phones in the hands of every missionary just in time for them to be locked in their apartments and only be able to do missionary work from their phones on Facebook and so forth. As I mentioned, the church name and the church symbol that is more focused on Jesus Christ Church pageants were discontinued. Renovations to Salt Lake and other older temples began in preparation for this big earthquake that is inevitably coming. Women, youth, and children may now serve as witnesses for baptisms and sealings. And this is just a list of a few of the changes that have been made. There's so many more that have been made and so many more that will be made. It truly is an ongoing, continuing restoration, and it is so awesome to see a prophet in action, receiving that revelation line upon line, precept upon precept, getting us closer and closer to where we need to be to welcome the Savior in his second coming. To close out the book, Sheri Dew gives us this awesome quote. She says, "You will each have challenges in life, but I invite you to consider something. Throughout the rest of your life, your most difficult challenge will probably be to follow the prophet. There's going to be an increasing gap between his counsel and what the world insists is acceptable and reasonable. There will likely be moments when you don't agree with something he says, but I hope you remember what I'm telling you today, that your greatest safety will be in following the prophet. The Lord has given his followers, members of his church, an ironclad guarantee, a supernal spiritual safety net, that he will choose his prophet, that he will never let the man lead us astray. This is a stunning guarantee, one of the surest ways to get on or get back on or stay on the covenant path is to follow a prophet." I have received a personal spiritual witness multiple times that Russell M. Nelson is the living prophet on earth today, that he communicates with God directly, receives revelation for the entire world. Now, as we go into General Conference, I hope this gives you a better idea of who the prophet is as a man and give you a better testimony of the divine calling and mantle that he possesses as the prophet of God, and that the words he is telling us in these addresses aren't his words alone, but the words of God that he has given to him so that we can know the will and the mind of the Lord. So there you have it. That is the Insights book from Sheri Dew. I highly recommend reading it if you haven't read it already. Again, this was just a sneak peek, some of the highlights, but the spirit is so strong when you read that book, and I promise if you do read it or listen to it on Deseret Books app, I promise that you will walk away with a greater testimony that this man is called of God. But that's all I got. Hopefully you enjoyed this format. I hope to do more of these book highlights in the future. They're not all going to be that long, but hopefully you got some good insights out of that today. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.